American democracy is what we call a guided democracy in countries that we don't like Iran. So in Iran, elections are, putting aside questions of the credibility of elections, the candidates are vetted by the leadership, the clerical leadership. Guardian Council decides who can run. Okay, we're pretty much the same. Here, candidates are vetted by corporate interests. And the way it's done is that unless you have huge corporate financing and support, you just can't run. I mean, Obama won over McCain primarily because the financial institutions liked him better, so poured money into his campaign much more than McCain. And if you check funding and polls, you find that the advertising and so on, in fact, carried him over the edge. And that's true all the way along. I mean, elections are basically bought. Congress, for example, has very low ranking among the population. It's in the teens sometimes. Nevertheless, the overwhelming majority of incumbents win. What does that tell you? It tells you people are voting for candidates that they don't like because they don't have any choice. These are fundamental defects in the democratic system. It's a huge democratic deficit, as it's called, and it shows up. There's a very sharp division between public policy and public attitudes on a host of major issues. In fact, both political parties are well to the right of the population on a great number of critical issues. And the population feels it can't do anything about it. So, for example, last polls I saw about this, about 80% of the population said the government doesn't work for the people. It works for a few big interests looking out for themselves. Well, that's 80% of the population. But if you had asked the next question, they didn't do it, well, what are you going to do about it? People probably would have said, well, I can't do anything. There's no way to do anything about the fact that the government's in the pockets of the rich. And a few big interests, corporate interests primarily. That feeling of helplessness, impotence, everything's run by somebody else, I can't do anything about it, that reflects a democratic deficit. These are enormous problems with the way the democratic system functions. I mean, there's something similar in most places, but the United States is pretty extreme in this regard among the industrial democracies. Very good, very fine political economist, Thomas Ferguson. It's what he calls his investment theory of politics. It interprets elections as occasions on which the groups of investors coalesce to invest to control the state. And as he shows over the past century, that's quite a good predictor of what policy is going to be, just looking at the coalitions of investors who became the principal architects of policy. Today it's not merchants and manufacturers, it's multinational corporations and financial institutions, but the principles remain about the same. In fact, we saw a good example of it in the last election, 2008. Obama's victory in 2008 was primarily due to a big flow of capital that poured in, especially toward the end, from financial institutions who preferred him to McCain, and that carried him over the edge. And of course, they expected to be rewarded, and they were immediately. The country was in the midst of a big financial crisis, so the main task was to deal with it. Obama picked an economic team to deal with the crisis. The team was selected entirely, almost entirely from the people who were responsible for the crisis. That excluded quite prestigious figures, Nobel laureates and others who had been very critical of what they'd done. And not particularly surprisingly, they produced a policy which rewarded those who were responsible for the crisis, often with criminal acts, and left everyone else in the dust. I don't want to overgeneralize. There are a lot of different people in Congress and the White House and so on, but by and large, overwhelmingly, they simply respond to different interests. 75% of the population who was skeptical of the election were basically correct. Policy is determined by power, by concentration of domestic power. And it's not a big secret how power is concentrated domestically. It's concentrated in huge conglomerates, which are internally tyrannies, in effect. They're mostly unaccountable to the public. They're given enormous rights, far beyond the rights of persons. They're linked to one another in all kinds of alliances. They have an overwhelming effect on state policy, which largely keeps to what they want. So and if they happen to differ, if there's splits among them, you get things coming up in elections. Where they agree, it doesn't come up. Like some of the major issues for the U.S. population are things like the international economic agreements, what are called trade agreements, so they don't have much to do with trade, or say the free trade area of the Americas or the trade deficit and so on. These are really top issues. They don't come up in the elections. And they don't come up in the elections for a very simple reason. The business world is on one side, and the population is on the other side, very largely. And they know it. So like in the Wall Street Journal, they say, the problem is if these things come up, opponents of these agreements have what they call an ultimate weapon, namely the general population. So therefore we have to keep them from coming up. And they don't come up in elections, and they're not discussed. And the population more or less knows that, even if they don't know all the details about, GATS and so on. Yeah, except, anyone who tries to break out of that rather rigid framework is going to be marginalized because they don't have the resources and they don't have the media and they don't have the organization and so on. It's going to take large popular movements to change this. And that can happen. It's happened in the past. I mean, that's why freedom and justice have expanded over the centuries. It's never been gifts. It wasn't gifts from the rich and powerful. These are things that were won. They were won by the labor movement and by the women's movement and by the civil rights movement and by human rights movements. They're won by popular struggle. Then you get you move forward. But they're never given as gifts, and they won't be in the future.